the town is big. His brother was a pastor. His brother Dennis. Lung cancer.
We're going to move towards getting started because I unfortunately have to keep going. Nancy, thank you so much for closing those doors. And I will go take care of those in a moment. But I want to say how thrilled I am to welcome as a guest lecturer in this course, Rabbi Mark Miller. Rabbi Miller is originally from Colorado and received a dual degree in psychology and history from Northwestern University, was active in community organizing for the Jewish community, and then went to Hebrew Union College, which has campuses that are all over, but Jerusalem, Cincinnati, LA, and I think New York. So Rabbi Miller went to Jerusalem and to LA for his seminary training. He also was appointed, I think, about 2 months before I was. So both of us have been acclimating to an incredibly dynamic congregation over the past year. And we met earlier this week to discuss ways that we can work together. And I felt immediate kinship with him because we both are kind of living through the same context together, being in this wonderful city and these wonderful congregations. And as you all know, there's a long history of interaction and relationship between Christ Church Cranbrook and Temple Bethel. And this begins again this relationship and renews it. I would also want to just point out again, for the benefit of everybody here, that the instruction in this course has been really wonderful. I'm particularly grateful to Troy for all of the work he's done. And so please keep him in mind. As well as Pastor Manisha, who will be coming, I think, from her time preaching. And then Pastor Joyce will be coming on in December when we actually turn to Christianity. And also let you know, in 2 weeks' time, we'll have the local imam of the Bloomfield Hills Mosque come and do a guest lecture as well. This is kind of a facet to the course. So, without further ado, I'm going to give you Rabbi Miller. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So, as the Reverend said, it's been a nice opportunity for me to start to get to know your community a little bit more. Last night, actually, at Temple Bethel, which is not very far from here, we celebrated our 165th anniversary. Temple Bethel is the oldest synagogue in the state of Michigan, going back to 1850. And we started in Detroit, and as the Jewish community has done, we moved slowly out a little further. We were all the way down in the city, and then our most recent building back in 1922 to the 1970s was at Woodward and Gladstone, a big classical structure down there. And in 1973, we moved up here to Bloomfield Hills, which I understand at the time was still called Birmingham. So I'm trying to figure that out, but maybe you'll help me later. But in any case, we have a connection here going back to 1973, and much further than that with this community. My cousin, excuse me, it was a late night celebrating last night at the temple, but my cousins who live here in Michigan, who are lifelong Detroiters, and my cousin Max, who's 87, was actually on the Cranbrook baseball team in 1943.
Wow.
So I have pictures of him standing on the mound near here. As I said, the connection between us as a Jewish community and this entire institution, and specifically this church, goes back quite a ways. And I'm very excited to continue working with you to build that, because one thing that I do know about all of us is that for all the things that distinguish various religious groups, we have much more in common than we do, for example, with people who do not have religion. So there are lots of things that make us who we are, but what we share is a faith in a world that can be put into some sense of order and has something that goes on beyond what we might see or feel or understand. But there's something greater than us. So this partnership is something that will only grow. Thank you for having me this morning. So I was given the simple challenge of condensing 4,000 4,000 years of Jewish tradition into 38 minutes or so. So something easily done.
You can go 39.
39. That throws it over the top, so thank you. That'll allow me to talk about God a little bit. So I know that you've already had some conversation about this, and I'm sure everyone walks into the room with some sense of Judaism, Jews, connection. So I don't want to sort of make it too remedial. I understand that there was a wonderful lecture, was it last week?
Yes.
About the idea of Judaism as a civilization and sort of how it fits into the history of other civilizations, which is a great context. And the reason I think it's such a perfect context is because Judaism is often misunderstood as a religion. And what I mean by that is that, especially when you go back to the roots of Judaism thousands of years ago, it never was a faith. It never was meant to be that one part of people's lives. It was meant to be an overall structure to people's lives. And so Judaism involves, yes, religion and theology. It includes culture, music, dance, food, law, a sense of order. Really, it's a full civilization. And there are leaders who still think of it that way today, although we today live in a world where really it is a religious faith in a world that we live with all sorts of other culture and ideas. But it really is a civilization that goes back a long way. And for most of those 4,000 years, it's been encompassed by 3 pillars. And I thought that might be an easy way for us to jump into the conversation. And part of what I hope is that it will be a conversation. So please, if there are questions, feel free to jump in, because it would be helpful for me to understand where we're coming from. But I'm going to lay out an idea of what the pillars of Judaism are. And then certainly at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So the 3 historic pillars of Judaism are God, Torah, and Israel. God, Torah, and Israel. And in a sense, those 3 encompass generally everything that it means to be Jewish. There's lots of things that are a little slippery and don't quite fit in, but as a general idea, we're going to start with those. So all people, I think, ask what are known as the great ontological questions, meaning that as a human being, part of our need is to wonder where we came from, what our purpose is in life, and perhaps where we're going. Those are the kind of questions that we have answers to. We might not always be confident about those answers. I tend to think that just about all people in the world are actually not theists or atheists, but have some sense of doubt and some sense of wonder. It's part of what makes us human. And so the God part of Judaism always has been a sense of wrestling with what it means to have something beyond us. We had to get here somehow. There had to be some reason, some way that we arrived. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have a connection to science. It doesn't necessarily mean that we don't believe what our senses tell us when we observe the world, but those senses and those sciences can never give us the full picture. There's no way that they can have a complete answer. Are there any scientists in the room? Just curious, a few. So one thing that scientists will tell you is that the scientific method involves something called proving the negative, which means you can always try to figure out what doesn't work as a complete answer, but that doesn't mean that you always have a complete answer. For example, let's take gravity. Right? Gravity works. Right? There's no way to deny gravity, and yet there is no proof for gravity. What I mean by that is it's a theory. It's something that we take for granted. We're sure it works, but we can never be 100% sure. I think God works in the same way. There's lots of evidence for God. There's lots of understanding about God, but it's not something that we can have an absolute proof about, which is why we have struggled with the concept of God for so long, for so many thousands of years. So one of the great stories in Judaism goes back to Abraham. And Abraham, of course, was the first Jew. When we think of the Torah, which is the story of our people, the beginnings of the people, the early stories of creation, Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, all those stories are stories about all of humanity. Those are not Jewish stories specifically. It doesn't become a personal story until Abraham. So Abraham has this relationship with God, and Abraham starts to develop this idea of monotheism and belief in the one God. The Torah does not tell us all the details. The Torah is a very brief book, really, if you think about all that it encompasses. So our ancient sages had to come up with stories that would fill in the the gaps and trying to understand what happened in between what's written in the Torah. So Abraham, we don't know anything about his childhood, for example, but the Midrash, which is these ancient collections of stories, tell us about Abraham as a child. And when he was a child, we're told that his father owned an idol store. Not like a glasses store or a convenience store, but an idol store, which in the ancient world you can imagine was a big deal because for people before monotheism, people before an understanding of one God, they needed their various gods. They needed help with fertility and growing crops and rain and everything else that you could imagine, and they had their various idols to help with that. So Abraham's idol store, Abraham's father's item store. So his father left town one time, and Abraham didn't really believe so much in these idols, and so he took a stick, a baseball bat of some sort, and smashed all the idols in the store except for one, the biggest idol, which was up on a shelf, if you can imagine, and he put the baseball bat in the idol's hand. So his father comes home from his vacation, walks in, sees his entire store smashed up and destroyed, says, Abraham, what did you do? Why did you ruin my store? Abraham said, it wasn't me, it was that guy. And his dad said, Abraham, it's a piece of clay, of course it couldn't do that. Of course it couldn't do that. To which Abraham replied, as you can imagine, well, if he couldn't destroy the other idols, how can he do anything else? So it gives a sense of Abraham's evolving understanding of what it means to be in relationship with God. Not gods, but God. So it goes all the way back to that beginning, and that's part of our tradition, trying to understand what it means that there's a force greater than us. It isn't an idol, it isn't the sun or the moon or the stars, it's something else. And of course the difficult part of that is that God is not sensible by us. We can't sense God. We can't see, touch, hear God in a direct sense. And that's been the Jewish custom all the way back. So the early stories in the Torah, of course, talk about God walking through the Garden of Eden, or God reaching a hand down into the world. But yet, certainly for a long time after that, Judaism developed into this idea that God is invisible and cannot be touched by us. So one of the great rabbis in history, Moses Maimonides, who lived around the 12th century, one of our great leaders certainly, he described an idea that we can only describe God by using the negative. In other words, if you say God is great, that's still putting a limit on God. If you say God is mighty, strong, tremendous, large, any word that you put on God is limited. So you have to say things like, God is not limited. God is not mortal. God is not human. The only way to understand God is through what God is not, because God is greater than our understanding. And in fact, God is so much greater than our understanding that we can't adequately put words to God. And so Maimonides taught that even when we anthropomorphize God, when we say God reaches a hand down, we do that because that's our limits as human beings. We can't understand God in a true sense, so we do our best. We use our language, we use our images, we use our thoughts, but inherently God is so different from us that we can't quite understand. Another way of putting it is that there is a mystical tradition in Judaism, and really when we say mystical, that doesn't mean magical. Sometimes it's misunderstood. But the mystics, what they did was they searched for hidden meanings in text and tradition. So they would take stories that were given or understandings and try to find underneath them what they meant. So one of the mystical traditions about God, one of the understandings about God is that there are what are called emanations, divine emanations. And sometimes you'll see these pictures that look like chakras that you've seen from other faiths. It's like almost an image, it's not a body, but it's sort of like a diamond shape with dots around 10 areas and all the interconnected lines. One of the symbols of Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism. But what that is are the different emanations of God, which start from the very highest, the crown of God, and go to the lowest. But what we're taught is that even the lowest direct emanation of God, the physical presence of God, is just beyond our reach. We can try to understand it, but just beyond our reach. That doesn't mean, of course, force that we don't interact with God. That doesn't mean that God isn't present in our lives, but in a physical sense, we can't quite touch God. And I think it's an important distinction because, again, once you can touch God, at least in the Jewish understanding, once you can touch God, then it's a short line between God and idols. And that was the big dilemma. The challenge of early Judaism was you've got people, a whole community of people who believe in physical representations of God. That golden calf is God. That statue is God. That pharaoh is God. That's what people understood. How do you take them away from that understanding and bring them to understand a God that is all around us and invisible? It's very difficult. And still today it's difficult. We like to think that when Abraham came around, there was an instant change to monotheism. That's the story that we tell. It's not quite true. And here's one of the ways that we know. There's a Jewish prayer that we say in our daily and weekly services. We say it all the time. It's called Micha Mocha. And it's a prayer that reflects back on the great miracle at the Red Sea. The Exodus is the great story of Judaism, being slaves in Egypt, eventually getting free and moving out into liberation. And that moment at the Red Sea, where the sea parted and we walked across on dry land, is the key moment in that story. So this is a prayer that remembers that moment. And it's actually taken from the Torah. It's in the book of Exodus with the sort of a victory song that is sung by the Israelites as they're crossing the sea. So in that song that we still say to this day, the words are Micha Mocha Ba'elim Adonai, which in Hebrew means, who is like you, God, among the gods? Now what's wrong with that phrase? Who is like you among the gods? Right. We, to this day, I'm going to go in a few minutes and have a prayer service with our children at our Sunday school, and we're going to say those words. Who's like you among the gods? We're saying out loud, God is the greatest of the gods. The greatest of the gods is a problem. And it reflects a historical development. It isn't what we believe today. Right? I don't believe there are gods or multiple gods, but it reflects our history, which was that over a long period of time, people were struggling with this idea of one God. It isn't easy, again, especially when you can't touch God. So as we developed through periods of time, and as I'm sure you know, when you read the Bible, especially what you would call the Old Testament, part of what happens is that over and over, the children of Israel believe and then fall back, and believe and fall back. They're back and forth constantly. The first thing that happens when we go out into the desert, cross the Red Sea, great miracle. We go out into the desert. What's the first thing that happens? This is another great Jewish word that you should know. The people start to kvetch. That word?
Never happens here.
Never. Good. I wouldn't expect it in church. But they kvetch. They complain. They even say, take us back there. This is no fun. My feet hurt. Where's the food? Where's the water? It's a problem. They've just witnessed this great miracle, and if there's ever going to be a time that you would believe or be able to believe, that would be it, and it doesn't work. Of course, they do go forward, and it works out, but they complain. They get out into the desert to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up on the mountains, and of course what happens? They create the golden calf. Right? Moses is literally up there on the mountain receiving the word of God, and down below the people are dancing around a fire, throwing their earrings in, and making this little molten golden calf. And it happens again and again. They come into the land after wandering in the desert for 40 years, enter the land of Canaan. Again, this should be the beautiful end of the story. There they are in the land of milk and honey, but they meet the locals. And the locals are idol worshipers, and they go back and forth through the kings, through the prophets. The prophets, that's really their job. Right? They're reminding people, get away from all these prophets, these false idols. So it's a difficult thing, and Judaism, I think, in the sense of God being this pillar, has long tried to be pragmatic. One of the reasons I would argue that Judaism has lasted for so long is because it has never been a dogmatic faith, but has been a pragmatic faith, which means it has to work for real people in the real world. And if it didn't work for real people, I do think it would have faded away at some point, because life can be difficult. Certainly life can be difficult when you're a people exile and in diaspora and spread around the world and powerless as we were essentially for 2,000 years without a land and a country to call our own. Jews always, by the way, have lived in the land of Israel, even through those 2,000 years, but a small minority. So through all those years, it's difficult. And if Judaism hadn't adapted and met the needs of real people, I don't think it could have survived. 4,000 years does not come easily. All these great empires that we hear about, Babylonians, Persians, Assyrians, Greeks, all these great empires that rose and fell, and somehow Judaism, this very small group of people, we were never more than probably 10% of the world. Go back to the Roman Empire, which was sort of the height of Judaism's population boom, never more than 10% of the world, and even that probably a little high. So a small minority, and yet this has lasted for 4,000 years because God has been there for people in a way that works for real people. The name Israel, by the way, which is what we call ourselves, it's a complicated word because when we hear Israel today, of course the first thing we think about is the state of Israel. But Israel means many more things, and this is sort of the transition into the second pillar. Remember, God, Israel, Torah. So the second pillar of Israel goes back to the name of Jacob. And you may know, do we know the story of Jacob in the book of Genesis? So Jacob, of course, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, one of the forefathers. Jacob is out in the desert himself. He's running away from home. He's running away from his brother who has threatened to kill him. And he's out there and has an experience with God. And part of what happens is he physically wrestles with an angel, a messenger of God. And when he does so, he defeats the angel. The angel can't get away. And as a reward, really, for letting him go, the angel says, I'll grant you whatever you want. Just let me go. Jacob refuses. And the angel says, okay, I will grant you a new name. You are no longer Jacob. You will be known as Israel. And does anybody here know what the word Israel means? It's a Hebrew word, Yisrael. Any guesses?
Wrestling with God.
Literally, it means wrestling with God. Yisar is a Hebrew word that means he wrestled, and El is God. He wrestled with God. And it's been taken on as a name, which really is an incredible thing, because if you think about it, what we call ourselves, the people of Israel, the children of Israel, sometimes just Israel, as a people, within our name is this concept of wrestling with God. Wrestling with God. Meaning that God is not a done concept. It's not easy to believe in God. It's not easy to understand God. It's not easy to follow what God wants from us. But our job as a people is to wrestle with God, meaning not to try to defeat God like Jacob did with the angel, but wrestling in the sense of understanding, struggling, trying to understand, which again, on the pragmatic side, is part of why in Jewish tradition it's okay to be angry with God. Right? There are times in our lives when things can be very difficult, certainly at times of loss or pain. And it doesn't mean that we simply praise all the time. Part of our life is difficult. And we can have a relationship with God that is real in the sense that it's not only one-sided. God doesn't only do to us. God doesn't only love us. God's love is paramount and important. But there are times when we don't necessarily feel that way. And struggling with God, wrestling with God, is part of the way that we figure out the way to get through the difficult times in life as well as the good times. And again, on a pragmatic sense, to me, part of what that means is that when we go through difficult times, sometimes people lose faith. One of the terrible after effects of the Holocaust in Europe was that a whole generation of Jews, not all of them, but a large part of that generation of Jews that survived lost faith. And it would be hard not to. We're not talking about a standard tragedy or difficult time in life. We're talking about on a massive scale, a thing that's so unbelievable and terrible that we really probably can't quite imagine it. And people lost their faith. But faith came back, and part of the reason was because people could experience this wrestling, this difficult relationship with God, and it didn't have to go away. Getting angry with God, or feeling like God was missing or gone or not there, didn't have to mean the relationship was over. It meant that's part of a true relationship. So Israel, the name of Israel, goes all the way back to that story. So Israel means numerous things. I said today we tend to think of the state of Israel, but there are two other primary ways that we use the term. One is called Am Yisrael. Am is the word for people, so the people of Israel, which is all of us. And then there's Eretz Yisrael, or the land of Israel. So we have a fascinating relationship with the land of Israel. And of course, it's become really, I guess, more complicated in the last numerous decades, back to 1948, once the state of Israel was founded. And the reason is, for 2,000 years, and that's the time between the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70 CE, between 70 CE and 1948, we did not have a land to call our own. And so for those 2,000 years, Israel was embodied in our prayers. And we spent every day longing, yearning, striving, hoping for Israel to be redeemed. Right? Redeemed essentially from its captors. During that time, one of the ways that we survived was on that hope. Hope is a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing in our lives. And again, for anyone, for any human being, when you lose hope, I think you tend to lose most of your will to live. Right? That's the difficult thing. But when you have hope in something, that allows you to keep striving, keep working, keep plodding through what might be hard. And again, all those years we were in what we call exile. Jews were spread around the globe. Jews lived in Europe and Africa and Asia and the Americas, all around the globe. There are very few places Jews haven't gone out of necessity. But during that time, every Jew around the world was praying for the return of Israel. And we're not worried about borders or exact definitions, but Israel, this ancient homeland that sustained us. So Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was something that was truly important because when you go all the way back to the early stories, Abraham left his home in Ur. He was from the small town of Ur. Anyone know where that is? Just think of the map. What? Iraq. Modern day Mesopotamia, but modern day Iraq. Just if you think of the map today, it's really where Iraq is today. So he on foot went from Iraq through the Fertile Crescent over to the land of Canaan. It was not his land, he was sent there. And at that time, he still didn't have the land. The first thing that happened that was a connection to the land was when his wife Sarah died, and he bought what was called the Cave of Machpelah, which still exists today in just outside of what's Hebron. So there's this town of Hebron. When you hear that name on the news, it's not usually a good thing. Very difficult place, unfortunately, a lot of tension, violence, it's very difficult. But Hebron is the place where Abraham bought this cave to bury his wife. He was eventually buried there as well as some of the other forefathers and foremothers. So that became a connection to place which wasn't fulfilled until a few generations later when Joseph, of course, went down to Egypt. His family grew and eventually was taken out of slavery by Moses and made it to the Promised Land. So that's when Israel became a place that was ours. And again, we can go back and forth of how that worked, and it was a struggle there also. But all the way back to the end of the Exodus, we have this connection to the land, which is very important because, again, if you think of Judaism not as a religion, but as a civilization, land is vitally important. Every people, every culture in the world has a land. A few of them are displaced even today. Think of Kurds or in China, Tibetans. There are people who are displaced, but every culture, every people has a land, right? There's a reason why we call them Russians or Chinese or Belgian. Whoever they are, everybody has a place. And land is where culture grows. That's where you have a language that's unique, and food and dance and unique things about a people. So we had a land where our culture grew up, and then we were dissociated from that land for 2,000 years, which is why the Eretz, the land of Israel, was so important. So back in about 100 years ago, let's say, early modern Zionism, which goes back really to the 1890s, a man named Theodor Herzl, and he was a witness to something called the Dreyfus Trial. Has anyone heard of the Dreyfus Trial? In France. So this was, essentially, there was a Jewish, I believe he was a captain in the army, the French army, and he was accused of treason. It was very clear that he had not committed this treason, but he was accused because he was Jewish. And Theodor Herzl was a journalist watching this trial. So he watched this farce of justice take place, and his revelation was that if the Jews don't have a course, wasn't a new idea because long before the late 1800s, there were pogroms and expulsions and inquisitions and all kinds of terrible things. There's a 2,000-year history of not very pretty times for the Jews. So it wasn't new, but his understanding that change was we have to do something about this. What the Jews had been doing is moving around. Every time they'd get, say, kicked out of England in the year 1297, they'd go down somewhere else, maybe to France. They'd get kicked out of France and they'd go over to Germany. They would move around trying to find a new home or a new protector, a lord, a prince, a king who would take them under his protection. His answer was, we need our own place where we can live and thrive and protect ourselves. So that was the beginning of modern Zionism. Part of what grew out of that connection was that over time, Jews started to move back to Israel, purchase land from other landowners, absentee landowners, but it became what Herzl called a dream. He said this dream of Israel can only be fulfilled when we eventually get our own homeland. He died before Israel was formed, but in 1948, when Israel was finally declared as a nation, all of a sudden everything changed. And as I said, it got a little more complicated, because when you're having hope, when you hold on to this dream for so long, that becomes sustaining. When all of a sudden you have to build roads and protect people and govern and make sure there's water and food, it's much more difficult. In a sense, right, I don't want to simplify the difficulty Jews had, but in a sense it was easier to be wandering because we didn't have to take care of anything. Which, by the way, is the same story as the Exodus. Part of the reason why they complained so bitterly when they left Egypt was because, well, what do we do now? Everything was taken care of. We were slaves, but they provided the food, they provided the shelter, they provided the protection, and all of a sudden we had to do it, and we had no experience and really no ability to do that. So in that sense, it was the same thing in 1948. All of a sudden, rather than simply hoping and striving and yearning, we had to deal with the reality of an Israel. And so that's been the challenge since 1948 is how do we build a country that is actually reflecting of the ideals of what built that country. Not easy, and again, I don't want to veer into kind of current Israel because that's a whole other topic, but it's not easy to build an actual country based on the values that you want to live according to. Very difficult. So God, Israel, and number 3 is Torah. So Torah at the most basic level is the Torah. In Jewish houses of worship all around the world still today, every week on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, we take a Torah out of the Ark, out of the Holy Ark, and we read from it. The Torah is a scroll. It's essentially a book. It's the 5 books of Moses, but it's still written on a scroll today. And it really is, to me, a beautiful throwback, because part of the message of having a scroll is that even though we've got modern technology, we've got books, I can print out the Torah on a piece of paper anytime I want to, but it's not the same as this parchment scroll that's handwritten and passed down carefully from generation to generation. So the Torah is the story going back to the very beginning, the story of creation, up through really the end of Moses' life, just before the children of Israel enter the Promised Land. And it's important that the Torah ends there. And the reason it's important is because we read the Torah every year. It's on a cycle. So we start in the fall. There's a holiday about the Torah where we go back to the beginning, start reading from the very first story of creation, spend the entire year reading every week another portion of the Torah until at the very end we read where they're just on the edge of Israel, about to enter, and Moses dies up on the mountain. It's really a story, if you think about it, of our personal journeys. Every one of us starts, we're created, we have a beginning to our life, we go through trials and tribulations, we journey, every one of us is on some sort of a journey, and at the end, the truth is that none of us have quite accomplished everything we want to. Moses desperately wanted to get to the Promised Land. He spent 40 years leading the Israelites through the desert, doing everything they needed, being their connection to God, and at the very end, he couldn't enter the land of Israel. He pleaded with God. Right? How many times do we see people pleading with God? We want our lives to go on a little bit longer. We want to depressing, but meant to reflect the reality that life is finite, and that it's okay that life is finite. That's part of what gives life its great meaning. And Moses, of all people, if there was one person who should make it into the promised land, it's Moses. But he doesn't. And yet we're taught in our tradition that the length of time Moses lived is considered the perfect life. Moses lived 120 years, and there's this wonderful phrase in Hebrew that people say usually on a birthday or as a well-wishing. In Hebrew, it's ad mea be'esrim. It means until 120. And it's really a wish if you think about it. May we live to 120. And by the way, at the end of Moses' life, part of what it tells us in the story is that he was still strong, his eyes were undimmed, and his strength was unabated. And the message there is that in an ideal sense, and again, Moses meant to reflect the ideal, 120 years, still strong, still with our faculties, and that's the way to go. Right? Would it be that way for all of us? It would be a wonderful thing. But that's why it's Torah. That's why it's the story that we're given. Now, there are those, of course, who read the Bible literally. And there may be people in this room who read it literally. Maybe all of you, I don't know. I won't ask. But I will say this, that Judaism, going back at least 2,000 years, has read the Torah and the stories that come along with it as symbol, as metaphor. What I mean by that is that one of the smartest things that one of my rabbis growing up ever said to me was that the Torah is not a science book, and the Torah is not a history book. The Torah is a book of values. The Torah is a book that's meant to help us live our lives. It's not meant to look at it and say, this is what really happened to Abraham or Moses or any of those. It's meant to help us live our lives. And as such, it's written the way it is to give us lessons. The end of Moses' life, it doesn't necessarily matter if he died on the mountain exactly the way it's described at exactly the point in his life. What matters is what we take out of that story. And at least for me, we can take a great sense of comfort out of his story because we know that at the end of Moses' life, the way he died, according to the Torah, was by the mouth of God. That's a strange phrase that the Torah uses, and it's been debated what exactly that means. And there are two primary answers. The first primary answer is that when it says Moses died by the mouth of God, it means that God spoke. God spoke, and God's words affected Moses' death. Just like God began creation with a word. Right? How did creation begin? God said, let there be light. God spoke. And the words that God spoke were the beginning of creation. It's a very powerful idea. God didn't craft the world. God didn't slice and dice the world. If you look at other creation stories from other cultures, it usually involves something physical. But in this sense, God spoke and the world came into being. In the same way, God spoke, and that was the end of Moses' world. But there's a second interpretation that I think is beautiful, which is that Moses died with a kiss of God. God reached down, kissed Moses, and that was what ended Moses' life. And in a sense, I think that's the message that we're trying to take from this story, that for each of us, whenever our time comes, and it will come, there are no immortals, but when it comes, each one of us has the ability to be kissed, held, and protected by God, because we have a soul in us, every one of us, that is pure and eternal, and that soul will live on and will return back to God. And so God's kiss is the way of bringing that soul back. So the message that we take out of the story, again, isn't how did it happen, when, where, why. It's for us, it's a message. So that's one little bit of Torah, and part of the reason I told you that story is to get the sense of how we interpret Torah. Because again, bringing the three together, God, Israel, and Torah, when I said the name Israel is about struggling with God, it means, A, there is a God to struggle with. B, we have a connection and a relationship that gives us not just the right, but the responsibility to interact with God and figure out what that relationship is going to be as Israel, as a people. And third, that even our sacred texts, the Torah of all things, and by the way, there's a whole series of texts that come later, the Talmud and commentaries and codes and all kinds of things later, but they're all based on the Torah. Even the Torah, our most sacred text and our most holy object, the Torah is considered the most holy object that we have. Even that we interpret from the beginning, from God's first words to God's last words. We interpret the Torah. We don't simply receive it. We do receive revelation, but then it's our job as human beings to interpret it. And the last thing I'll say about that is this. There's a wonderful rabbi out in California, unfortunately just passed away recently, but he taught this. Another thing that we do as Jews is we say a blessing every week over the wine. That's one of the key blessings that we say on the Sabbath and all sorts of other occasions. The words of the blessing are, "Blessed are you, God, who gives us the fruit of the vine," right? The grapes, the fruit of the vine. But you've probably never seen anyone hold up a wine glass with a bunch of grapes in it to say a blessing, right? It wouldn't make sense. We put the wine in there. And the reason that we do that, according to this rabbi, is that until we take our human hands and work with the grapes and turn them into wine, there's nothing to bless. God gives us the grapes, we turn the grapes into wine, and then there's a blessing. And that's what we mean by interpreting and working with Torah and tradition in order to make it something real in our lives. So that, to me, is one of the fundamental realities, which I said earlier about being pragmatic. We have a role in the world. We have a partnership with God, and that's what I think gives us the strength to continue to go on in times that might be difficult, and hopefully in times that are better. And one of the things that will make those times better is the continued relationship that we share. So again, I want to thank you for inviting me this morning. It's a nice chance to be here. I know that was a very quick and dirty sort of introduction, but I would love an opportunity to continue the conversation, and you'll decide if we have a few minutes for questions, but I will turn it back over to you.
We do have a few moments for questions. I don't have a few moments for questions. So if I could have JJ at about 10 of, will you bring Rabbi up into he wanted to see the sanctuary, so bring him up for a quick tour. And then, so we should close in about, let's just say 5 of. So there'll be kind of a jailbreak. All the ushers will be overwhelmed. But and then, so at 5 of, you just please close it. Maybe John, you be the timekeeper. And so close us in 10 minutes. And then can someone, all of you who are fit, Bill and company and Peggy, just make sure we get these chairs that we've set out aligned so that we can do children's chapel. Okay? Sorry to do all that. It's a little bit of an audible. Thank you so much for it was incredibly rich and wonderful. And I want to let you know, Rabbi came with somewhat short notice. We've been approached by the IFLC, the Interfaith Leadership Council. We received that grant, as you know. And one of the things that they said, wouldn't it be great if you had some representatives of the faith traditions come? And so I said, well, I think I can make some adjustments. So so Rabbi gratefully came recently to do that, and I called him this week. So thank you. That was incredibly rich. Please.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I have a question, and I hope it's not naive, and maybe it might be big, but I guess I'm confused about the roots of anti-Semitism. Is it because of a different interpretation of God that started, or was it based on land, or it's so big?
Sure. So part of, and it is a big question which deserves its own full conversation. But the quick answer is this, and I hope that you will accept this answer with the respect that it's intended. I say it respectfully. But anti-Semitism is different than political divisions. So if you go back 2,000 years, or 3,000 years, or 4,000 years, there are always cultures in conflict. And a lot of that conflict is over land and resources, because you've got empires and kingdoms and people's needs. So that sort of conflict goes all the way back. But anti-Semitism is a different kind of issue. And really, part of it goes back to the early days of Christianity. And what I mean by that is, as you all know, Christianity grew out of Judaism. Jesus was Jewish, the disciples were Jewish, it was a Jewish community. And part of the reality is that it grew out of a time that was very difficult in Israel. The Roman Empire was a mighty empire, an incredible empire, lots of things came out of it, but part of what we forget is that when people talk about the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, the way that the Romans kept peace was with an absolute iron fist. It was very difficult to live in the Roman Empire, and in the land of Israel, in Jerusalem and the environs, part of what happened was that it was not easy to have any expressions of faith. It was like a cauldron of pain and oppression. And so part of what grows out of any oppression, of course, is people striving for answers. And the reason why there were so many competing ideas back then, and if you think about Sadducees you've heard about, and Pharisees, and Essenes, and Zealots, and Christians, right? These groups were all growing out of this time of the Romans because there was so much pressure being put on the Jewish community that there was a real competition of ideas and a struggle to survive. Ultimately, at the end of the day, two groups survived. The Pharisees, which became the rabbis. So when you say rabbis, that's the group that grew out of what was the Pharisees. And of course, the Christians. Right? So today's Jews and today's Christians grew out of that. The rest of the groups faded away. So part of what happens anytime you've got one group coming to succeed another, which, again, the Christians at one point were trying to not just convert, but grow out of their Jewish roots. And we're dealing with a political election today, right? So if you want to win an election, there are two things you can do. You can talk about how great you are, and you can talk about how terrible your opponent is. Right? Every political election works the same way. There's a reason mudslinging works, because that's how it works. So that's why, I say this with respect, but part of what happened in early Christianity was an attempt to distinguish itself from this Jewish community that had been there, essentially to win the election. And so you do that two ways. Christianity, of course, developed its own theology and rituals and leaders and all that, right? That side. And then part of it was also, how are we going to leave behind this other group? How do we defeat this other group? And so anti-Semitism, the word, which it's a bit of a dirty word, and it wasn't used back then. So I want to distinguish, because it wasn't that 2,000 years ago, but what it was an attempt of a community to, on religious grounds, essentially, wasn't necessarily political, it wasn't land-based, it was, right, we're trying to have a theology that is a new one on the roots of this other one. So it was an attempt to distinguish and put that one behind. Over a long period of time, and really a long time, probably 1,000 years, that grew into a system that was very ingrained. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, of course, it became a big force. It became a political force. It grew, expanded far beyond what Judaism had ever been. Like I said, Judaism was never a major community. It's been an important one, but not a huge one. So as Christianity grew, I think those roots took hold, and eventually, especially when you get into the Middle Ages, and you have competing societies, because eventually, of course, you've got the growth of Islam coming out of Arabia, you've got a church that is trying to hold on, you've got divisions in the church, you've got reformations, everything happening. And the anti-Semitism that eventually grew out of that was largely cultural. You had a learned elite who understood things, and then you had a lot of masses of people who were simply trying to hold on to what they had and were given an easy way out. And there were places where it turned into very difficult things, obviously. You had things like blood libels, Inquisition, all these kind of problems, and I don't think that those reflect, I really don't think those reflect what Christianity is about, and certainly not what Christians are about today, but historically it grew out of that process and it took on a life of its own. And that's, 1,000 years is a long time. I think it's hard to imagine. So you take something that's just a little root or a seed, and over generations and generations, it turns into something that was probably never even expected. So that's a quick answer. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yes. So the
Sir,
question
could you
was,
please repeat repeat the question because it won't be heard
Yes.
on the,
The question was, if you're Jewish, is that your religion or your nationality? So historically, again, Judaism really is more of a civilization. Today, it is definitely a religion. So when I say I'm Jewish, that means that my faith is Judaism. It also means that I'm part of something broader. So Judaism includes the use of the Hebrew language. There are certain foods that are cultural, dances, song, culture that gets transmitted. That's part of it. But really, especially today, and especially in America, it's a religion. It's a faith just like others. But that's the difference. There's historical and there's today. But I think if you asked people on the street, they would say, that's my belief system. Yes.
But following up on that nationality, could I become a Jew if I acknowledge and go along with your theology, or is there something in my blood that prevents me?
Great. So thank you. Good question. The question was, can I become Jewish if I believe in it, or is it a nationality? So that one of the arguments that gets made, because sometimes Judaism is accused is the wrong word, but labeled as being a race, right? There's something racial about it. And part of the way that it's simply not true is that anyone can become Jewish, right? Judaism is a belief system that you can convert to. So if you accept the principles of Judaism, if you accept the culture, if you live a Jewish life, you can convert and become Jewish. Doesn't matter what race you are, what ethnicity, what country you live in, right? Those things don't matter. And just to say it out loud, part of Jewish culture is that when people convert, they're considered not converted Jews, but full Jews, right? No distinction. And it's an important thing, because if you go all the way back, the great leader King David, who's considered in some ways a Messiah figure, and I wish I had time to go into the word Messiah because it's important in this context, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. But David, as a religious, political, military leader, he came from Ruth, his grandmother, and Ruth was a convert. So David's roots are not Jewish, and yet he's King David. He's one of the greatest of us. So yes, you can convert. It's not a racial or nationality issue.
Yeah,
Sorry, guys.
9:55. Thank